Calories in versus calories out does not dictate whether you gain or lose weight. What does cause weight gain is keeping your insulin levels high, which causes you to store more fat and crave more food. By now, you've definitely been hammered with the narrative that insulin is the main driver of the obesity crisis. This line of thinking stems from the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, which was popularized by researcher David Ludwig and Gary Taubes. So let's critically review the main arguments for this model and let's see whether it holds any weight. So time for school. The carb insulin model of obesity, which we see commonly presented in the mainstream media, is that carbohydrates drive insulin release and insulin stops fat burning regardless of calorie intake.
When your insulin is high, the lid is closed. Your body can't burn that energy. But when the insulin's low, the lid is open. Your body burns that energy.
However, that interpretation is just a narrative used by wellness influencers, likely because they just don't fully understand it. The CIM doesn't actually contradict energy balance or the laws of thermodynamics as many people would believe. It simply proposes a reverse causation hypothesis. This gets complicated, so stay with me. So, in the energy balance model, which is the scientific consensus for how we gain weight, we see here that overeating tasty, hyper-palatable foods results in an increased energy intake, along with decreases in energy expenditure through movement and physical activity, which leads to a higher net calorie intake. This then leads to increases in circulating metabolic fuels like glucose and lipids, and these fuels are then stored as fat tissue and you gain weight. Whereas the carb insulin model flips this process on its head and suggests that what's actually happening is when you consume dietary carbohydrates, you cause insulin secretion. This increases fat storage, which then leads to circulating metabolic fuels going down because glucose and lipids leave the blood and are stored within fat tissue. This results in you feeling more hungry, so you eat more, and simultaneously decreases your energy expenditure through basal metabolic rate, movement and activity because you're fatigued, hungry, etc. So the CIM doesn't actually defy the laws of thermodynamics, it simply proposes a reverse causation hypothesis. One biological example that Ludwig refers to where a similar process is occurring is during the growth spurt of a child. So the cellular changes happen first, by which the bones start to grow and elongate, which creates the cellular and hormonal environment which drives the child to eat more to facilitate that growth. This is why you don't see children going on a 3-week bulking phase before every growth spurt. These processes happen simultaneously. Whilst this all sounds totally plausible on the face of it, upon analysis of the various stages of the CIM, we quickly see glaringly obvious limitations. So let's tackle things one by one. Apparently, when you raise insulin, you drive nutrients into adipose and trap it there. The rest of the body senses you're low on nutrients, and this drives hunger and calorie intake. However, this hypothesis falls on its face in several places. Although research like the PREDICT-1 study found that the glucose dip 2 to 3 hours after eating predicted an increase in hunger, shorter time until the next meal, and greater subsequent energy intake, foods that typically spike and drop blood glucose levels often have other characteristics that we know can dictate hunger. For example, they may be more processed, tasty, calorie dense, lacking in fiber, water content, and food volume. This is why in controlled research, where the only thing you manipulate is the fluctuation in blood glucose, they don't tend to see changes in subjective hunger or energy intake across the day. As a quick side note, even the satiety index back in 1995, although not perfect, ranked boiled potatoes as the most satiating food that was tested, despite having a glycemic index higher than that of table sugar. Moving on, if insulin causing low circulating nutrients is the reason people eat more and gain fat, then surely we should see obese people have lower levels of circulating nutrients. But no, people with obesity have higher levels of circulating nutrients. For example, this case control study looking at free fatty acid levels amongst lean, overweight and obese fatty liver disease patients found that the obese patient group had the highest levels of free fatty acids in circulation. In this review, we see that adipocytes decrease glucose uptake in peripheral tissues by the release of free fatty acids, meaning there is more glucose in circulation. And this study on over 1,000 non-diabetic Japanese workers followed people over 3 years and looked at whether free amino acids in the plasma were associated with insulin resistance. They found that higher concentrations of serum isoleucine, valine, tyrosine and alanine were associated with higher levels of insulin resistance in overweight and obese participants, but no association was seen in normal weighted people. So as you can see, overweight people tend to have higher levels of circulating nutrients. Now, without getting too technical, Ludwig tries to navigate this by suggesting that once people have become obese, the fat cells have reached storage capacity. And because the cells can't store any more nutrients, this is why you see increased levels of circulating nutrients. He claims it's more to do with the postprandial period 3 to 5 hours after you eat. So the cellular starvation process process occurs as they're gaining weight rather than when they're already obese. But this rebuttal is also silly because people with obesity often continue gaining weight. They don't just stop once they're a little bit fat. And because their blood already contains large amounts of nutrients, the cellular starvation hypothesis really does not provide an adequate explanation for this. Ludwig also claims that insulin leads to decreases in circulating metabolic fuel, which lowers your resting metabolic rate. Well, let's see what robust inpatient feeding studies have to say about that. For example, this metabolic ward trial admitted 17 overweight men to the ward where they consumed a high-carb diet for 4 weeks followed by a low-carb diet for 4 weeks with the same 2,400 calories for both phases and the same 91 grams of protein intake. Now, in agreement with the CIM, carbohydrate restriction did lead to increased fat oxidation, reaching a maximum within a few days and remaining constant thereafter. And the low-carb diet led to an increased resting energy expenditure both during the day and whilst asleep. However, this effect waned off over time, and in reality it was only 57 calories per day, which I can achieve by simply looking at food. That being said, despite the tiny increases in energy expenditure, they actually found that during the low-carb diet phase they lost slightly less body fat, 0.5 kilograms on the low-carb phase, which was less than the high-carb phase. Another metabolic ward study by Kevin Hall in 2015 also found the low-carb diets led to less weight loss compared to the high-carb diet. Now, you could push back against these studies and say, well, not only were they just a few weeks, but also total calories were controlled and you've trapped people in a metabolic ward for weeks, so you're not letting these food changes affect people as they would in the real world. How much would they eat if you didn't give them the meals? How much would they exercise or move around? How about cravings? These are valid points, and that's why we have other types of control studies called ad libitum trials where you allow people to eat as much as they like. In free living situations where they're still going about their normal day-to-day activities, researchers then monitor their habits and food intake accordingly. And this updated review of over 60 randomized controlled trials that included almost 7,000 men and women where they compared very low carbohydrate diets below 50 grams per day to balanced carbohydrate diets even as high as 65% of total energy intake over a period of anywhere from 12 weeks to 2 years, found that following low carb diets compared to balanced carb diets results in little to no differences for changes in body weight over the short term over a period of months and in the long term over a period of years, and this applied to people with and without type 2 diabetes. The free living ad libitum trials are especially important here because according to Ludwig, if left to your own devices, even if you actively try to control your calories, the carb-induced insulin release would cause nutrients to become trapped inside fat tissue. This would drive up hunger and you would eat more. However, that's clearly not the case, as even those types of studies saw minimal differences in weight loss outcomes over a period of many months. A final important point is that Dr. Ludwig is an accomplished doctor and researcher. However, he has weighty monetary incentives in low-carb assets such as books, courses and the like. So it's clear to see why he would continue to push this hypothesis despite so much evidence to the contrary. So to summarize, the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity is an alternative explanation for weight gain that suggests that high-carb diets elevate insulin levels, which causes fat storage and shifts those nutrients into fat cells, leading to a state of internal starvation as your blood no longer contains sufficient levels of nutrients. This is theorized to lead to adaptive decreases in energy expenditure and increased hunger, which leads you to consume more calories, leading to a cycle of further weight gain. However, almost every part of this hypothesis fails to stand on its own. When looking at multiple lines of evidence from cross-sectional nutrient biomarker studies, free living controlled human trials and the most robust metabolic ward studies to date, it's clear that carbohydrates aren't inherently fattening, and obesity is a result of a multitude of complicated biological, psychological and environmental factors that won't simply be tackled by reducing your carbohydrate intake. Class dismissed.